My name is Linda Martin, though in the Air Force, they called me Phantom. I'm 37 years old, a former combat pilot turned senior aviation strategist. I spent half my life trusting instinct and muscle memory at 40,000 feet, where hesitation gets you killed. But nothing in my training prepared me for what unfolded on that transatlantic flight. Flight 726 from Amsterdam to New York should have been routine. A metal tube. 8 hours. Silence. My brother Robert and I were returning home for our father's funeral, though for Robert, grief was optional. Contempt was not. Row 9. Of course, he took the aisle, claiming it without a word, leaving me pressed against the window like excess baggage. Entitlement was his native language. As I clicked my seatbelt into place, Robert leaned in, breath low, voice sharpened to a blade. "Don't forget," he murmured, "you're just a passenger now. No uniform. No rank. You're nobody special up here." I didn't respond. I stared out at the wing, steady and silent, while my jaw locked tight. Silence had become my armor long ago. Robert had never forgiven me for choosing the Air Force over the family law firm, never forgiven me for flying higher than the life he'd mapped out for me. And he had no idea how badly he'd misjudged what I still was. He mocked my career, my achievements, and my life choices. Even here on a civilian plane, he had to remind me of his perceived superiority. We were halfway through boarding when I heard the faint hum of the engines warming up. I leaned back, stared out the window, and let my mind wander. That was when the world shifted. The first explosion came from the right engine. A sudden burst of sound like metal tearing apart. The cabin shook violently. Overhead bins rattling. A sharp chemical smell filled the air. Before I could process it, the oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a terrifying snap. Passengers screamed. A baby cried somewhere behind us. I heard Robert curse under his breath. His face drained of color. He grabbed my arm with a death grip. Alarms screamed across the cabin, blending with the automated announcement, urging everyone to fasten their seatbelts. The plane tilted sharply to one side. I could feel the pitch angle shifting in ways that were far from normal turbulence. Then, through the static of the intercom, a voice cut through. It wasn't for the passengers. It was almost a whisper, meant for someone who knew how to listen. "Get me Phantom from row 9 now." I froze. Did I hear that correctly? The nickname, the call sign, Phantom. No one here was supposed to know that name. I turned toward the flight attendants. One of them was already looking around, panic in her eyes. Robert grabbed me by the wrist. "Sit down. You'll just make things worse. You're not flying this plane. You're nothing here." I looked at him steady and unflinching. "Not today," I said. My voice was calm but firm. I unbuckled my belt and stood up. The aisle was shaking beneath my feet, but I kept my balance. Passengers stared at me, some in confusion, others in fear. As I approached the cockpit, the head flight attendant stopped me. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. "Are you Phantom?" she whispered. I nodded once. She hesitated for a single breath, then opened the cockpit door. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Warning lights flashed across the panels, alarms blared, and the air smelled faintly of overheating circuits. The captain, a tall man with sharp features and sweat beading on his forehead, looked up at me. He was Dutch, and when his eyes met mine, I saw recognition. "You're Phantom?" he asked, his voice taut but steady. "Linda Martin," I said, stepping closer. "Former U.S. Air Force combat pilot, multilingual operations liaison. I can help." He nodded without hesitation and motioned me to the co-pilot's seat, where the first officer was slumped semi-conscious with an oxygen mask over his face. The captain muttered something rapid in Dutch, too fast for the flight attendants to follow. I answered with precision, my voice cutting through the chaos. I gave the first encrypted authentication phrase, my call sign, my clearance, my request. The captain's eyes widened slightly. He understood that I was requesting emergency coordinates through a secondary relay line to Amsterdam OCC. I continued with 2 more crisp sentences, switching to the emergency aviation jargon that I had once drilled into my memory. These 3 lines opened a direct priority channel, bypassing the usual cluttered frequencies, feeding our position and critical data straight to Shanwick and Gander controllers who monitored the North Atlantic corridor. As I took control of the secondary yoke, I felt the weight of 200 lives pressing down on me. Every instinct I had honed over the years roared to life. I stabilized the roll, corrected the yaw manually, and glanced at the flickering navigation display. Through the open door, just beyond the threshold of the cockpit, I could see Robert. He was standing in the aisle now, gripping the seat back for balance, his face a mask of disbelief. The same brother who had just sneered at me for being just a passenger now stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. He didn't say a word. He couldn't. I wrapped my fingers around the yoke, feeling its resistance, the vibration of a wounded machine fighting gravity. The captain's hand brushed mine for a moment as he transferred control. His voice was low, serious, but there was a hint of trust. "You take it," he said. I nodded, my voice steady. "I'm not flying alone, but I'll take responsibility." As the cabin fell silent, all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat and the distant hum of a single struggling engine. Before I touched the yoke, another map was already unrolling in my head, not of winds and altitudes, but of the last few years of my life. I had just finished a NATO rotation that moved me between Ramstein, Volkel, and several classified forward operating sites. Amsterdam was supposed to be a brief pause, a quiet decompression chamber before I flew home to New York for my father's funeral. I rented a short-term flat above a canal, packed uniforms into vacuum bags, signed off on my last security debrief, and tried to relearn what it felt like to walk down a street without checking for reflective glass. I thought I was done with the sky. The sky apparently was not done with me. Robert had been living in Amsterdam for years, practicing corporate law and cultivating the kind of European detachment he liked to weaponize. When he spoke to me, he called my career a phase. He called my discipline performative. He called my silence arrogance. When our father died, the will brought us back into the same legal and emotional airspace. And like most collisions, it was less about speed than trajectory. He had a plan for the estate. I had a duty to the truth. Those 2 things rarely share a runway. My decision to step away from full operational status in the Air Force looked from the outside like fatigue. The papers called it burnout. The truth was uglier because it was cleaner. Years earlier, a psychological assessment, 1 sentence buried in a dozen pages, flagged me as potentially unstable under sustained non-kinetic pressure. The phrasing was careful. The implication was not. My advancement stalled. My command pipeline froze. Rooms I used to enter with a salute suddenly required an invitation. I worked harder, flew better, taught longer, and spoke less. The flag never went away. I learned to live with it until the report was leaked. Not by an anonymous troll, not by a loose-lipped evaluator, but by my own brother through a chain of emails later uncovered in discovery during an unrelated civil dispute. He had forwarded it to a family attorney with a note that said, in essence, that I was not fit to hold fiduciary responsibility, leadership, or public trust. He was building a legal moat around the will long before our father died. He did not expect that I would ever see the documents. He underestimated my relationship with paper. I log everything. Pilots who survive do. That leak was my ghost wound. It never bled in public, but it kept reopening under pressure. I stopped arguing with people who spoke from impulse and started structuring my life around things that could be audited. Procedures, statutes, data, cockpit voice recorders, black boxes, chain of custody forms. If you wanted to call me unfit, you would have to do it in front of numbers that contradicted you. Revenge for me became a matter of record-keeping, not rage. I would let the truth do the shouting. So, I stayed in Amsterdam long enough to close NATO files. Long enough to book 2 tickets to New York. One for the brilliant son who knew the law. One for the daughter who knew what law looked like when you stripped away its theater. We boarded row 9 like it meant nothing. His voice landed first. "You're just a passenger." He believed roles were fixed once assigned. I believed roles were temporary until proven under stress. When the engine burst and the masks fell, no courtroom, no boardroom, no probate petition mattered. The only record that would survive was the one I wrote with my hands on the yoke and my voice on a compromised frequency. Still, even then, as alarms screamed and the fuselage shuddered, the ghost wound pulsed. That buried line about instability under non-kinetic pressure. I filed the feeling the way I file everything now, time-stamped, acknowledged, contained. Then I stood up, not to prove Robert wrong, but to make sure 200 strangers got to land in New York and bury their fathers, too. And if the world wanted to revisit that line in my file afterward, I would welcome the hearing. Numbers travel well across oceans. Truth, when recorded properly, does not fear turbulence. Our father built his fortune not in combat or in courtrooms, but through patient architecture of real estate and quiet investments that grew while we were too young to understand them. By the time he passed, there were buildings, portfolios, and family trusts that could shape the future of everyone who carried the Martin name. Robert saw those numbers not as a legacy, but as a crown, and he was already wearing it long before the funeral. Robert wanted control, complete, unquestioned control of our father's estate in New York. The morning before the flight, over bitter coffee at Schiphol, he spread out legal documents like they were battle plans. He spoke about probate court, executive rights, and tax strategies as if I were a stranger rather than his sister. When I asked about transparency, he smirked in that cutting way of his. "You're just a soldier," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "This is law, Linda. This is financial navigation, not whatever stunt flying you think translates here." He thought I was naive about money, but he never understood that flying a multi-million-dollar aircraft demands more precision, discipline, and decision-making than most boardrooms can fathom. Still, I let him talk. I learned early that silence unsettles people who thrive on control. The will itself was simple. Divide assets between the two of us with charitable endowments and scholarships in our father's name. Yet Robert kept hinting that he would challenge the division, suggesting I lacked the mental stability to handle fiduciary responsibility. It was a recycled version of the same poison he leaked years ago, a story he told behind my back to justify his need for dominance. Each time he tried to corner me with words, I wrote it down. I kept a small black notebook, no bigger than a palm, a habit I carried over from my Air Force days. Back then, every mission required precise logging. Altitude, fuel burn, radio chatter, even subtle engine tremors. Now, I logged Robert's insults, the exact phrasing of each dismissive remark, the tone he used when he called me unstable or reckless, not for revenge in the cinematic sense, but because documentation is power. If you want to dismantle a false narrative, you start with dates and exact words. On the morning of our departure, he leaned against the gate counter, signing some last-minute document on his tablet. I stood nearby, quietly observing the way he carried himself like he owned the ground under his feet. "When we land in New York," he said without looking up, "I'm meeting with the attorney. Don't expect me to include you in the strategic talks. You're not trained for this." That was the spark. Not because I needed his approval, but because he underestimated the strength of someone who doesn't argue for a place. They simply take the right seat when the moment demands it. Robert believed law and money were the only instruments that mattered. I knew otherwise. Life, like flight, demands a steady hand when engines fail. As we boarded, I slipped my notebook into my carry-on, feeling its familiar weight. It was my log, my truth, my silent witness. Robert could sneer all he wanted. Every word was already recorded. In the cabin, as the engines hummed and passengers settled, I looked out at the Amsterdam runway. My reflection in the window was calm, almost detached. I told myself, endure, record, respond only when necessary. That was my new combat strategy. Quiet precision instead of loud retaliation. Robert didn't know it yet, but his words would soon collide with a reality he could never control. When the right engine exploded and the cockpit called for Phantom, every log entry, every insult, and every buried accusation became irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was who could guide 200 souls home, and that was me. We crossed the midpoint of the North Atlantic when the first turbulence felt wrong, asymmetrical, like a hand shaking only one wing too hard today. CPDLC packets began timing out. AKR's messages duplicated, then vanished. While HF hissed with distant lightning, the kind you hear before you see out there. The captain fought the yoke gently at first, trimming, stabilizing, reassuring the cabin, but the pitch oscillation widened, shallow to steep, shallow again, then steeper. A continuous stall warning vibrated through the column. Not yet a full break, but close enough that muscle memory woke before conscious fear could form. Task saturation hit the cockpit like smoke. You cannot see it, but you cough, and everything takes 3 steps instead of 1 to get done. The first officer slumped deeper into his mask, eyes open, unhelpful, his hands twitching uselessly at switches that no longer routed any pressure anywhere reliably. I watched the primary flight display flicker, horizon bar stuttering, numbers ghosting, then reappearing 2 degrees off, then correcting, then offsetting again on my scan. I did not need perfect data to know we were outside our envelope. Airplane told me with vibration, with smell, with rhythm of alarms rising. The captain called for a descent, shallow, controlled, but the sink rate spiked anyway, as if gravity had decided to negotiate directly with the fuselage. He managed radios, failed systems checklists, engine parameters, cabin updates. His hands were everywhere, which meant no hand could stay where it needed to be. Vertical speed bled away, then surged. The flight director offered lies. The autopilot, already disengaged, blinked its indifference like a witness refusing the oath entirely. I scanned, not looking for perfection, only for trend lines, heading drift, wind shear signatures, thrust numbers that did not match our rate of descent. CPDLC refused our logons. ACARs dumped half messages that read like unfinished thoughts. And HF hissed with storms rolling somewhere far beneath our track tonight. The captain looked at me finally, the way pilots look at each other when ego is no longer useful, and said, "Take the secondary controls." My hand closed around the yoke. My thumb found the trim switch. My eyes narrowed to the thin horizon bar shaking like a pulse line. Memory took over where certainty failed. Elbow angles, wrist pressure, the calibrated patience of waiting 1 second longer before correcting to avoid pilot-induced oscillation amplification. Stall warning again, this time shorter. The nose wanted to wander. I let it, then coaxed it back like convincing a frightened animal to breathe. Passengers were praying, crying, bargaining. I heard it through the door like weather, background pressure you account for, but cannot change inside your own cockpit. Robert's face hovered in the periphery, disbelief, fear, pride collapsing. I ignored it because pride cannot hold altitude the way numbers can. When gravity tightens, we were between continents, between authorities, between options. The only jurisdiction that mattered now was physics, and physics is brutally fair to every pilot alive. I asked for weight, balance, winds aloft. The captain read partial figures. I inferred the rest, building a mental glide map no screen could display. The airplane sagged again. I eased the nose, traded altitude for control, time for certainty, because survival is always a currency you spend deliberately carefully. Task saturation was now measurable. The captain's breathing sped, his checklist cadence fractured. I spoke slower, shorter to cut his workload in half right there. Outside, clouds smeared into charcoal. Inside, our world narrowed to torque values, pitch angles, and the stubborn will of aluminum not to fold under panic. I knew we had minutes, not hours. Enough for one decision, maybe two corrections. Anything else would be theater, and theater kills at altitude quickly. So, I flew the airplane first, then the problem, then the procedure, because that hierarchy has saved more lives than any courtroom argument ever will. The captain's breathing had turned shallow as he wrestled with controls that no longer answered the way they were designed to. He looked over his shoulder at me, the weight of 100 alarms flashing in his eyes, and spoke just one word, low and strained. Phantom. The call sign was not a question. It was a recognition, a request for me to step out of the shadows. I slid fully into the right seat, hands steady on the auxiliary controls. The first officer was still slumped against the bulkhead, dazed and unresponsive. The captain gave me a nod, muted, urgent. "The standard frequencies are useless," he said, voice tight. "We're not getting clear data from Shanwick. Do you have another path?" There was only one, and I hated that I knew it by heart. During my NATO rotation, I had been granted access to a classified relay line through Amsterdam's OCC, Operations Control Center, a channel that could cut through the static when every civilian frequency failed. It required a military clearance handshake, a series of codes layered with voice verification. The captain didn't have the clearance to open it. I did. I toggled the encrypted panel that hid under a protective cover, the one most commercial crews never touch, unless a war game scenario is in play. My thumb hovered for half a second. Then I pressed the switch and spoke in Dutch, crisp and unwavering. Second phrase, third phrase. Then the channel opened. This was the first of 3 phrases, my identification and request for emergency coordinates. There was a pause, then a burst of static, and a voice on the other end answered in Dutch confirming my clearance. I followed with the next 2 phrases. Additional authentication strings that combined call sign, mission ID, and a one-time NATO relay key I had memorized years ago. It felt like slipping back into a uniform I no longer wore. The weight of an oath I thought I had left behind. The OC took less than 30 seconds to triangulate our position, verify our flight path, and push a direct feed of weather and alternate landing vectors to Shanwick and Gander. The captain's eyebrows shot up as the navigation screen, which had been blank and stuttering, began to populate with stable data streams. "How did you—" he started, but I cut him off with a raised hand. "Fly the airplane." "I'll handle the line." Vertical spike number 3 struck hard when OC's next transmission came through. The remaining engine was now running hot, bleeding oil at a rate that suggested it might seize completely. The words were clinical, but the meaning was brutal. We should prepare for a dead stick glide scenario. If the engine quit, we would have to fly on whatever altitude we could preserve and glide toward a safe vector. If such a vector existed in the middle of the Atlantic, the captain swallowed, a small twitch at the corner of his mouth. I saw him doing the math. Weight, altitude, glide ratio, wind shear. My brain was already a step ahead, recalling emergency profiles drilled into me during training sessions that simulated catastrophic engine failures over open water. "I'll keep them updated," I said. My voice was calm, but my pulse was beating a tempo that belonged to a combat zone. "You fly the pitch. Keep us stable. We need altitude more than anything now." I relayed our altitude, current sink rate, and fuel metrics back to OC. They fed real-time wind vectors, turbulence pockets, and cloud density straight to my screen. It was the kind of data package that usually requires minutes of decoding. We didn't have minutes, so I interpreted on the fly, adjusting our glide envelope in my head. Outside, the Atlantic stretched dark and merciless below us. No land in sight, just gray water broken by white caps like teeth. I felt Robert stare from the cabin behind me, heavy with the realization that his just-a-passenger sister was now speaking a language both literal and technical he would never understand. He didn't need to. 200 lives did. As I finished the third Dutch confirmation phrase, authentication complete. Vector and weather feed confirmed. The cockpit fell quiet for a single breath. The possibility of losing the last engine was no longer theoretical. It was the scenario we had to plan for. I looked at the captain and said, "If we go silent, I'll take the glide. Be ready to dump weight." He nodded once, trusting me, trusting Phantom. The captain and I split the cockpit the way surgeons split a failing heart. One mind for the cut, one mind for the rhythm. I spoke to OC and Shanwick in clipped sentences, translating their wind vectors and minima into numbers he could feel through the column. He flew. I calculated. Then the workload inverted like a stalled wing snapping through the horizon. He looked at me jaw tight. "I have never flown glide only with this many souls." I answered without ceremony. "Then I will." We made the handoff with no performance, no debate. He slid his palms off the yoke. I wrapped mine around it, thumb resting on the stubborn trim switch that felt hotter than it should. He took the radios, his cadence evening out, now that he had a single lane to drive. My voice cooled further, shaving words until only data remained. "Pitch 2.5 down. Trim 1 notch. Hold bank at 3 degrees right to counter the crosswind predicted at our descent corridor. Confirmed sink at 800 feet per minute." The airplane bucked. I let it talk. The sine wave of control began. Shallow confidence. Sharp doubt. Shallow confidence again. Each oscillation taught me the next correction. Each correction taught me the next restraint. When I fly in crisis, I do not chase perfection. I chase the trend that keeps everyone breathing. The captain relayed to Gander the numbers I fed him. And for the first time since the explosion, the cockpit felt like a single organism instead of two people drowning separately. OC pushed an updated weight estimate. I ordered a fuel dump. He hesitated, calculating legality. I reminded him quietly that legality is meaningless if we arrive as debris. He keyed the command. The jet lightened its shoulders. Our glide ratio improved marginally, but margins are how planes survive and biographies get written. A new shudder rattled the pedals. Rudder response lagged, then jerked. I feathered inputs, coaxing the tail back into line the way you calm a spooked horse. Small pressure, time, repetition. "You are flying by feel," he said, not accusing, almost reverent. "There is nothing left to trust," I replied, "except the air and the time it gives us." I narrowed my scan. Attitude indicator, airspeed tape, vertical speed, the wavering horizon through the windshield's haze. Everything else was noise. The captain read back another advisory. Possible convective burst cells forming ahead along our glide path. I altered heading 2 device, stealing a softer layer of air, promising to pay the debt with a steeper flare later if I had to. He did not argue. Trust is a currency earned mid-fall. In the cabin, the intercom carried his voice, not mine. He told them we had additional support in the cockpit. He did not say my name. He did not need to. Names do not slow sync rates. Work does. Meanwhile, Robert's silence pressed against the door like weather. He had run out of vocabulary for contempt, and fear had no grammar he could wield against me. The oscillations narrowed. Control returned, not as a trophy, but as an agreement between gravity and discipline. I felt the airplane settle into the profile I wanted, a wounded animal that had decided to follow me home. "You have got it," the captain said. "I have got it," I answered, and meant responsibility, not pride. Then OC's next packet arrived, and every number on my screen hinted that the engine we were nursing was about to stop, pretending it could help us at all. If it died, we would trade altitude for order, glide for grace, and every second for one shot at a strip of concrete no chart had promised us, because one chance, managed well, is a landing today. The moment came without warning, and yet every nerve in my body knew it was coming. A sharp shudder rippled through the frame, the kind that says something deep inside has given up. The remaining engine coughed once, twice, then went silent. Not a slow fade, not a partial throttle, silence. The sudden absence of thrust was louder than any alarm. The aircraft shifted from powered flight to pure glide. A 170-ton glider skating through thin air. I locked my grip on the yoke. "Engine 2 is gone," I said, my voice calm. Even as the captain's eyes flashed wide, he confirmed, scanning the dead gauges, flipping switches that no longer mattered. Hydraulic pressure dropped to 0, and with it, the luxury of automated control surfaces vanished. Every adjustment now had to be coaxed through manual trim, through brute force and intuition. Vertical spike number 4 hit when I called for flaps, and nothing answered. The indicator light blinked red, mocking me. "Flaps are not responding," I said flatly. "We'll fly clean, but I'll need to feel every change in AOA." The captain nodded, already reading my intent. He monitored altitude and wind speed while I did something no civilian passenger is ever supposed to witness. I flew by touch, not by instruments, not by autopilot logic, but by the living pulse of the fuselage beneath my hands. The nose dipped too fast. I eased back. Too much back pressure and we would bleed energy. Too little and we'd sink too steeply to recover. Every second became a negotiation between lift and gravity. I shifted my weight slightly, adjusting rudder pedals with the care of someone tuning a delicate instrument. The captain called out altitudes, 28,000 feet outdropping, but I barely heard him. The plane and I were having a conversation that only we could understand. There was a brief moment, 4 seconds, maybe less, when my mind froze. I will not admit that out loud. Not yet, because I'm supposed to be unshakable. But as I felt the control surfaces resist me, as I realized I was alone in this mechanical silence, a single thought flashed. If I fail now, no one will know why. Then I forced that thought down, buried it beneath layers of training and instinct, and kept flying. The cockpit had narrowed to essentials. My breathing, the captain's voice, the hiss of dead systems. OC came back on the line with a blunt assessment. "Prepare for glide landing," they relayed through the Dutch operator. Shanwick and Gander confirmed. We were too far from any major runway, but there was a decommissioned Cold War emergency strip in upstate New York marked on a forgotten map within a narrow glide envelope. It was a long shot, but it was our only shot. I adjusted trim manually, feeling the metal groan as the control surfaces moved sluggishly. Without hydraulic assist, every correction felt like dragging a steel door against a storm. The captain's hand hovered near mine, ready to take over if I faltered, but he didn't. He saw the focus in my eyes, the quiet calculation. This was my fight to finish. "Linda," he said quietly, almost reverently, "you have the controls." "I have them," I replied. And I did. Not just the yoke, but the weight of 200 lives hanging in this impossible silence. We were now a glider, and I had one chance to guide it home. The silence of a dead engine feels different at cruising altitude. It is not quiet. It is tense, like a room full of people holding their breath. I asked the captain to stabilize pitch while I switched fully to data mode. "OCC, I need winds aloft at our current grid, temperature deviation from ISA, and updated turbulence vectors," I said into the encrypted channel. My voice was calm, but inside I was plotting every variable as if solving a lethal equation. OC responded with clipped precision, relaying data to Gander. Within seconds, Gander confirmed our minimum sink rate if we held a glide profile at 3, 2 digs down, with a speed of 240 knots. It was thin, but it was workable. I trimmed manually, feeling the stubborn resistance of the tail. Every small input mattered. Too much nose up and we'd stall. Too much nose down and we'd overspeed into structural limits. I ran mental calculations on weight distribution, fuel dump results, and surface temperature at potential landing zones. "We need the optimal glide slope, Captain," I said. He nodded, eyes locked on the horizon. "Then let's find the one thread we can walk." We were still high over the North Atlantic, but not high enough for comfort. With no thrust, every foot of altitude was a coin spent, and the bank account was shrinking fast. OC pushed me a potential approach vector toward an abandoned military strip. Once used for emergency Cold War drills, it was barely within range, just a speck on the margin of our glide path, but it was better than the ocean. "We have one shot at this," I told the captain. "Miss it, and we are out of skin." Vertical spike number 5 erupted from the cabin. Then a flight attendant's voice broke over the interphone. "We have a passenger with a cardiac episode, seat 14C. No pulse for a moment, but we're trying CPR." The ripple of panic spread faster than the vibration of the wings. I heard muffled cries, prayers, someone calling for a doctor. I clenched my jaw and forced myself to stay in pilot mode. "Tell them to continue compressions," I instructed. "We will be on the ground before the clock runs out." The captain glanced at me, surprised by my tone. I wasn't just promising a landing. I was committing to it as if failure wasn't an option. "We'll touch down before medical time expires," I repeated, loud enough for him and the interphone to hear. The cabin fell into a strange silence, the kind of silence that believes. I tightened my grip on the yoke and fine-tuned the angle of attack, feeling the subtle tremors of air flow along the fuselage. My training had always emphasized the importance of trust in numbers, but here instinct was just as critical. I watched the vertical speed needle settle at -800 feet per minute. Stable, but relentless. "This profile buys us 26 minutes of glide," I said, eyes scanning between instruments and the dim shape of the horizon. "We used 20 of those to reach that strip." Robert's face flashed in my mind, his arrogance, his mockery. Yet he was now silent, probably staring at the cockpit door, realizing that the soldier he dismissed was calculating his survival down to the last foot of altitude. I let that thought fuel me, not as anger, but as clarity. I called OC again. "Confirmed final approach heading, wind shear data, and emergency vehicles on standby." They acknowledged, relaying updates to Gander and back. My voice never shook. I felt the weight of the jet, the heartbeat of every passenger, the pressure of every calculation. One chance, I whispered to myself, my fingers white on the yoke. And I will not waste it. The makeshift strip was nothing more than a forgotten scar in the wilderness, a stretch of cracked concrete surrounded by dense forest. Emergency trucks lined the sides, their lights flashing faintly like fireflies against the dusk. I held the yoke with both hands, my palms slick, but my mind cold and precise. OC had confirmed landing gear deployment, but the status indicators flickered. "Gear may not be locked," the captain said, voice low. "We'll know when we hit." I made the decision fast without asking. "We're going to touch nose first, just enough to force mechanical lock on the mains," I said. He looked at me as if I were insane, but he didn't argue. When you only have one shot, you commit to it like it's a promise written in blood. The aircraft trembled as I adjusted pitch. The AOA was razor-thin between glide and stall. I called out the last checklist manually, my voice steady. Speed 230, altitude 2000, flaps non-functional, manual brakes armed. My left hand hovered over the emergency brake lever, ready to yank it with everything I had. Vertical spike number 6 hit when I checked the nose gear camera feed. Nothing but static. I toggled again. A blur of black and white. No clarity, just a suggestion of shape. "We're blind on the gear," I muttered. The captain's lips pressed into a line. "Then we land as if it's not there," I answered myself. The treetops loomed beneath us, dark and sharp. I eased the nose down slightly, aligning with the faded center line of the strip. My breathing slowed. This was the moment every hour in the simulator, every combat landing under crossfire had led me toward. I heard nothing but the whine of wind and the faint clatter of loose panels on the wings. "Brace," I said into the intercom. My voice cut through the cabin, crisp and final. I imagined Robert's face somewhere behind that door, pale, gripping his armrest. For once, I didn't care if he mocked me again. If I did this right, he wouldn't have words anyway. The ground surged upward like a wall. I lowered the nose deliberately, harder than standard protocol, using the forward momentum to shove the mains into place. A metallic thunk reverberated through the fuselage, a sound that could mean lock or break. I didn't wait to find out. I pulled slightly back, leveling for touchdown. The front wheels hit first with a jolt that rattled my teeth. The main gear slammed down next, accompanied by a deafening screech of rubber scraping concrete. Sparks erupted on the left side, showering briefly like a fountain of light. The smell of burnt rubber and hot metal flooded the cockpit. "Manual brakes now," I said, and yanked the lever. The aircraft shook violently as the emergency braking system kicked in, far rougher than automated deceleration. We skidded, bounced once, and I felt the rear tire shred. Smoke poured past the windows, blurring the thin line of the runway. The captain called out distances. 500 foot. 300. His voice was strained but clear. I held the yoke steady, adjusting only enough to keep us on the center line. The edges of the runway blurred with the trees, dark and waiting. I could hear passengers screaming behind us. Somewhere, someone was praying out loud. My heart was a hammer, but I never let my hands tremble. This wasn't a landing anymore. It was a fight between momentum and will. The brakes shrieked. Smoke thickened and the forest raced closer. I pushed harder, leaning into the yoke as if my weight alone could slow us. Every second felt like a lifetime. 45 feet, the captain shouted. The trees were right there like an approaching wall. I gave the brakes one last brutal pull. The aircraft lurched, metal groaning in protest. We skidded sideways for a breathless instant, then stopped, 40 foot short of the tree line. For a moment, No one moved. No one breathed. Then the cabin erupted with the raw sound of survival. Sobs, cheers, laughter breaking like waves. I sat frozen, my hands still locked on the yoke, the smell of burning rubber searing itself into memory. We were alive. The cabin was filled with applause, a thunderous wave of relief crashing over the wrecked silence that had hung there for the past hour. People were crying, hugging, whispering thank yous into the cold air that still smelled of burnt rubber and adrenaline. I heard the clapping, but I didn't feel it. I sat motionless in the cockpit, my fingers still gripping the yoke, as if it were the only thing keeping me tethered to this world. 4 seconds. That was the truth I hadn't told anyone, not even the captain. There had been a moment right before touchdown when I froze. Not because I doubted the landing profile, not because I feared death, but because an old memory slammed into me like the backwash of a failed engine start. The memory of the day they pinned me with that psychological label, unstable, under non-kinetic pressure. It had been years ago during a routine evaluation after a NATO exercise. The examiner had asked me what I'd do in a high-stress emergency. I answered correctly clinically, but I could tell from his eyes he wasn't convinced. He wrote his report, and it followed me like a shadow I could never outrun. And in those 4 seconds on final approach, I felt it all over again, like a voice whispering that I wasn't meant to hold command in chaos. I don't know if anyone noticed. The captain might have seen my eyes glaze, but I snapped out of it before my hands betrayed me. The 4 seconds felt like 4 hours, but they were gone in an instant when instinct took the reins back. I pulled, I braked, and we survived. Still, I know those 4 seconds will live in my mind far longer than any applause ever will. The passengers were still cheering as I reached for the small black notebook in my side pocket. The log I always carry. The one where I write every critical moment, every choice, every variable that could be dissected later. I flipped it open and wrote with a steady hand. 4 seconds. Next time 0. The captain leaned closer, his voice quiet amidst the chaos. They're calling you a hero out there. I shook my head, eyes still on the page. Heroes don't freeze, I murmured. He didn't respond, but his silence carried a respect I hadn't expected. The flight attendants opened the cabin door, letting in the chill of the evening and the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. Paramedics were waiting with stretchers, but many passengers stepped off the plane under their own strength, some pausing to bow their heads in gratitude as they passed by the cockpit. I stayed seated. I wasn't ready to face them. From the corner of my eye, I saw Robert standing in the aisle. He didn't speak. He didn't sneer. His face was pale and wet with either tears or sweat. For the first time in years, he looked at me not as his younger sister, not as a rival, but as someone he couldn't quite comprehend. I offered no words. Silence, once again, was my weapon of choice. Then came the first call from the outside world. A reporter shouted from beyond the cordon, "Who landed that plane?" I ignored it, but I knew the answer was already out. Someone had told them my call sign. It was only a matter of time before Phantom turned from a nickname into a headline. Later that night, as we were escorted to a temporary shelter for debriefing, I overheard the captain on the phone with someone from FAA operations. Words like unprecedented landing and procedural review floated in the air. I realized what would come next. The investigations, the interviews, the lawyers. They would tear apart every decision I made, every control input, every hesitation. Cliffhanger or not, I knew the story wasn't finished. While the world outside was calling me a hero, FAA and the airline were already preparing their questions. Because the airline was U.S. based and we landed on U.S. soil, FAA joined the NTSB. And when they asked, I would have to decide whether to admit the truth about those 4 seconds or let them believe I was flawless. For now, I kept it in my logbook, written in ink that would never fade. 4 seconds. Next time, 0. The first wave of news hit within 12 hours of the landing. Headlines screamed about a passenger-turned-pilot who saved 200 lives, but the narrative quickly split into factions. Some praised my quick thinking and military training, while others questioned whether I had overstepped my authority by taking the controls. A sensational broadcast on a national network aired a heavily edited segment of the cockpit recordings, framing it as if I had seized command from a reluctant captain. The anchor's voice was dripping with judgment. Was this a heroic act or reckless interference? I didn't watch the full report, but snippets flooded my phone. Friends from my NATO days sent messages ranging from pride to disbelief. I ignored them all. Silence had always been my shield, and I wasn't going to break it now. But as the media storm built, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the same pressure I'd felt during the investigations years ago. It wasn't fear. It was the recognition that people love to rewrite the truth when they don't have all the data. Vertical spike number 7 arrived like a knife when an online tabloid published my old psychological evaluation. There it was in black and white. The phrase potentially unstable under non-kinetic pressure ripped from context and plastered across headlines. Within hours, it became ammunition for commentators who questioned why someone with a questionable mental profile had been allowed to intervene in a critical emergency. I didn't need to ask how that report surfaced. The trail was obvious. Years ago, Robert had forwarded those documents to his attorney as part of a plan to exclude me from our father's will. Now, somehow that same document had mysteriously leaked to the press. Robert didn't admit it, but I could see it in his eyes when we met for the first time after the news broke. He was nervous, fidgeting, his confidence cracked. "You didn't think they'd trace it back to you, did you?" I asked him quietly without anger. He said nothing, but the silence was louder than any confession. The airline's PR department scrambled to manage the narrative while FAA officials prepared a formal inquiry. Lawyers from every angle started circling, eager to attach liability or credit to someone. Meanwhile, I chose to remain still. No interviews, no social media statements. I let the noise swirl around me like crosswinds. My attorney, a meticulous woman with a sharp voice and sharper mind, stepped in. "We'll handle this," she said. She filed a legal motion demanding an investigation into the leak of my personal records, citing defamation and breach of privacy. Her strategy was surgical. Let the evidence speak. Let the truth emerge without emotional outbursts. In private, I opened my logbook and wrote one line. Media storms are just turbulence. Steady hands, steady mind. It was my reminder that survival doesn't end with landing the plane. Sometimes the real battle begins. After the wheels touched down, Robert avoided me for days, but I knew he could feel the weight of what he had done. The side plot was no longer hidden. And while I didn't seek revenge in loud, fiery ways, I understood that the truth, documented, precise, undeniable, was the sharpest weapon I owned. The FAA and NTSB hearings were nothing like the roar of the cabin or the chaos of the cockpit. They were colder, sterile, a room lined with polished wood, microphones, and faces that hid judgment behind practiced neutrality. I walked in wearing a simple suit, my logbook tucked under my arm, like a weapon that didn't need to shout to be sharp. The investigators started with the black boxes. The DFDR and CVR extractions played on a screen in front of us. Every alarm, every call-out, every sound of the cockpit during those final minutes was replayed for the panel. I watched my own voice emerge from the speakers, calm, clipped, calling out pitch angles and glide ratios. Then the moment of truth, the captain's voice, strained but unmistakable. "Get me Phantom. I need her on comms now." The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Some of the people who had come in ready to doubt me leaned forward, realizing that I hadn't seized control or played the hero. I had been called forward because there was no other choice. I stood and opened my logbook. Every detail was recorded. The exact time the first engine failed, the altitude loss per minute, the sink rate trends, the vectors calculated from OC relays, and the adjustments for winds aloft and ISA deviations. I laid out the flight profile with precision. Every second, every degree, every nautical mile accounted for. My voice was even, my tone analytical. I didn't need emotion. The data spoke louder than any story. One veteran pilot on the board, a man with decades of commercial experience, leaned back in his chair and narrowed his eyes. "Miss Martin," he said, his tone a blend of curiosity and challenge. "Do you understand how many lives you put at risk by taking the controls of a commercial jet without current certification?" I looked directly at him, unflinching. "Yes," I replied. 200, including my own. That is exactly why I didn't stay silent. The room fell quiet. I let the moment hang, not to dramatize, but to make sure every word landed where it needed to. The captain asked me to assist. The autopilot had failed. We were 30 minutes from land with one dying engine. Waiting for external guidance wasn't an option. It wasn't about being reckless. It was about acting before the window closed. I walked them through my decision-making process step by step. Why I chose a glide profile instead of a controlled ditching, how I balanced speed against altitude, and why the Cold War Strip was our only viable landing point. Every figure I gave was supported by the CVR timestamps and DFDR graphs on the screen. When I finished, the chairwoman of the panel looked at me with something that felt close to respect. "Thank you, Miss Martin," she said. No applause, no warmth, but it was enough. As I left the room, I caught sight of Robert in the back row. His face pale. He wasn't part of the hearing, but he was there, watching the narrative he'd tried to twist unravel in front of him. I didn't acknowledge him. I simply closed my logbook and walked out, knowing the data had already spoken on my behalf. The storm with FAA and NTSB had barely settled when the legal battle over our father's estate resumed. Robert had been preparing for months, thinking he could paint me as unstable and unfit to handle our family's assets. But the narrative he tried to create fell apart once the truth about the landing and his role in leaking my old psychological report began to surface. The side plot turned into a full-blown revelation during a probate court session in New York. My attorney presented email evidence showing Robert's deliberate attempts to discredit me, including the forwarded evaluation report and correspondence with his legal team. For the first time in years, Robert's confidence cracked in public view. His usual smug expression was replaced with something I had never seen before: shame. Vertical spike number 8 hit when Robert stood up, cleared his throat, and addressed the judge. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, wavered. "I need to make something clear," he began. He admitted in front of everyone that he had intentionally leaked my psychological file, not because he believed I was unfit, but because he couldn't handle living in my shadow. "She was always the brave one," he said, his voice catching. "She became the soldier I could never be, and I hated her for it. I let jealousy guide me." The courtroom went silent. I stared at him, not with anger, but with a deep, weary understanding. Robert turned toward me, eyes glistening. "I'm sorry, Linda, for all of it. For the things I said, the things I tried to take from you." I let his words hang in the air. I didn't move. Finally, I said, "Forgiveness isn't a gift I give you. It's a moral obligation I give myself to stop carrying the weight of what you did. I don't hate you, Robert, but I won't let what you did define me." The judge ruled in my favor. The portion of the estate Robert had tried to control was restored to me, exactly as our father's will intended. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, just the quiet realization that justice, when done properly, is rarely loud. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed, microphones waved, but I stayed composed. Robert stepped beside me, his posture deflated, but genuine. "You deserved better from me," he said quietly. "I can't change what I did, but I can start making it right." I didn't answer him directly. I simply said, "The best way to make it right is to stop trying to fight the wrong battles." Then I walked away, my logbook tucked under my arm as always, a reminder of what truly matters. Facts, actions, and the courage to face both. That night, I wrote one final line about Robert in my notebook. Redemption comes slowly, but at least it starts with the truth. Colonel Frank Dawson found me 3 weeks after the hearings. We met at a quiet airfield training center in upstate New York, a place that smelled of hydraulic fluid, jet fuel, and the crisp bite of autumn air. He looked the same as I remembered. Squared shoulders, calm gaze, the kind of presence that made even a silent room feel commanded. "Linda," he said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "We've been watching everything. Your landing, the hearings, how you handled the fallout. I came to offer you what you've earned back. Full reinstatement, full command track if you want it." The words landed like a weight in my chest. I had once wanted that more than anything. The uniform, the authority, the skies under the insignia of a mission bigger than myself. But I had also spent years proving I could survive without it. "I appreciate it," I said, my voice steady. "But I'm not going back." "Not the way I used to." He tilted his head as though expecting this answer, but still curious. "Then what do you want?" "I want to teach what happens when things fall apart," I said. "Not just procedures, mindset, the mental survival tactics when every alarm screams and the ground is too close. I want to train them for the moments no manual covers." Dawson smiled slightly. "Special emergency instructor," he mused. "That's not a title we've used before, but I suppose for Phantom, we can make room." It was official within days. My role wasn't about combat sorties or medals anymore. I was assigned to a joint emergency response program working with both military and civilian pilots. My focus was singular: how to stay calm when the aircraft is no longer a machine but a falling question. The first time I stepped into the simulator as an instructor, I felt that familiar hum in my bones. I watched a group of young pilots strapped into the mock cockpit, their hands eager but untested. We ran scenarios: engine failures, electrical fires, full hydraulic losses. Some performed with mechanical precision, others cracked under the unseen pressure. Vertical spike number 9 came on a Thursday. One trainee, a bright but nervous lieutenant, hit a critical failure sequence and froze. 6 seconds, long enough to lose altitude, long enough for panic to write its own outcome. I stood behind him, my arms crossed, waiting until the silence was too loud to ignore. Then I leaned in. "Do you know what it's like to freeze?" I asked. He swallowed, nodding slightly. "I do," I said, my voice low but unshaken. 4 seconds. That's how long I froze before I landed that jet in the wilderness. 4 seconds where my mind went blank. I'm not proud of it, but I own it. You can't train fear out of you, but you can train what comes after. The room was silent, every eye on me. I told them about the moment, the static in my head, the sudden memory of a psychological report that once tried to define me, and how I clawed my way back to action. Those seconds don't define you unless you let them. You break their grip by moving anyway. the lieutenant blinked, exhaled, and reset his controls. I saw something shift in him, the same shift I had once forced on myself. The realization that courage isn't about never freezing, but about thawing faster than fear can take hold. That day, I wrote another line in my logbook. Teach them 0 seconds. Months later, I recognized him before he spoke. Thomas, seat 23F. The boy who had stared at me through the cockpit door while I wrestled a glider from the sky. He was older now, just enough to carry a quiet confidence in the way he walked. He found me after a training session, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. "Miss Martin," he said, voice respectful, but earnest. "I want to learn, not just flying. I want to learn how you did what you did, how you stayed calm when no one else could." I studied him for a moment. There was something raw and unpolished in him, but also that rare fire you can't teach. "Training isn't easy," I said. "It's not about the thrill. It's about precision under pressure and being willing to fail 100 times in silence." "I'm ready," he said simply. Thomas began with the basics, moving from ground school to the simulator, always pushing harder than anyone expected. He was stubborn, but in the right way. I saw him taking notes in a battered notebook, much like my own logbook. When I asked him why he was so persistent, he said, "Because I saw what it looks like when someone refuses to quit. I can't unsee that." Major twist number 3 came during a high-stakes emergency simulation for advanced trainees. One of the senior instructors, a veteran pilot with decades of experience, collapsed mid-session from a sudden drop in blood sugar. Panic rippled through the room as the simulation kept running. Thomas didn't hesitate. He slid into the seat, hands on the yoke, eyes scanning the failing instruments. "Dead stick scenario," I called out, testing him. "You have no engines. Altitude's dropping fast. What's your move?" Thomas's response was sharp, his voice steady. He outlined a glide profile, cross-checked the wind, aloft data, and stabilized the simulator as if he'd been born in the cockpit. When the emergency crew helped the instructor recover, the entire room was silent. I felt a surge of something I rarely allowed: pride. Not in myself, but in the proof that legacy isn't about medals or headlines. It's about passing the skill of staying calm when everything burns. At the final evaluation, I signed his recommendation for a full scholarship. But I made one condition. The scholarship would bear our father's name, not mine. "Because this is about more than me," I told Robert, who had quietly attended the ceremony. "This is about building something that outlives the fights we thought mattered." Robert stood at the back of the room, hands in his pockets, watching Thomas accept the scholarship. For the first time, I saw in his face a flicker of understanding, the weight of pressure, the meaning of control, when lives hang on every decision. Later that night, I closed my logbook with a final entry. "Teach them to rise higher than fear, and let the name Martin stand for more than survival. It should stand for those who refuse to let fear win." Thomas left with his wings that day, but I knew he would return, not to thank me, but to teach someone else what it means to hold steady when the world shakes. And that, more than any landing I ever made, felt like the true victory. The reunion flight took place on a crisp spring afternoon in New York. The airline had reserved a quiet hangar, and one by one, the passengers of that day walked in. Some carried flowers, others simply carried the weight of memories they couldn't quite put into words. There was a table with photographs of the landing site, smoke rising from the wheels, fire trucks circling, and faces stunned but alive. I stood off to the side, listening as survivors shared what they remembered. A mother recalled clutching her child and whispering prayers, convinced she'd never see another sunrise. An elderly man recounted the metallic screech of the wheels hitting the cracked runway, and how he thought, This is it. This is how it ends. They told these stories not as accusations, but as confessions of fear and gratitude. I didn't speak for a long time. I didn't stand there as a hero. I stood as someone who understood the cost of survival. The moments of silence afterward. The way time itself feels heavier when you know you've borrowed it. When I finally did speak, my voice was steady but soft. I wasn't just a passenger, I said, glancing at the faces looking back at me. But I wasn't alone either. None of us made it through that day alone. There was a quiet hum of agreement, the kind of understanding that only comes from those who've shared the same breathless moment between life and death. Robert was there too, seated in the back, his posture no longer rigid with pride. After the gathering, he approached me carrying a simple white envelope. He didn't say much, just placed it on the table between us. Inside was a signed document, a formal statement relinquishing any claim over our father's disputed assets. More than that, Robert had pledged half of what he had secured to fund an emergency response scholarship through the training foundation I had started. It's time I contributed to something bigger than my grudges, he said quietly. I looked at him, reading the sincerity in his face. There was no need for hugs or dramatics. I simply nodded. I don't forgive you because of this, I told him, my tone firm but not unkind. I forgive you because it's the only way I can move forward without carrying both of our mistakes. He nodded, accepting the truth without argument. That night, I opened my logbook. On the first blank page, I wrote seconds. Remember, no one is perfect, but anyone can learn to hold steady. It wasn't a note about the past anymore. It was a reminder for every student, every pilot, every person who might one day face their own moment of stillness before action. Later, as the sun dipped below the skyline, I stepped outside onto the hangar porch. The evening sky was painted with faint contrails, the NAT routes shifting like chalk lines redrawn by invisible hands. I breathed in the cool air and let the silence wrap around me. I no longer needed applause or recognition. My purpose had become simpler: to teach others how to hold their own skies, no matter how turbulent. Before we part ways, we'd love to know where you're reading from. Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today, wherever you are. We hope you carry the story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next.